So then you have some human genetic disorders caused by mutations. So a mutation, we've already learned about some of these. We've learned about chromosomal mutations, gene mutations. And so these are changes in your DNA, in your genetic material. So harmful effects produced by an inherited mutation is a genetic disorder. Okay, so we've talked about how mutations can be good or bad, but a lot of the times they tend to be negative. So anyway, a lot of mutations are recessive, so that's good. A lot of the times you're going to notice when we're talking about these mutations, they're so severe, a lot of the times the person does not live to bear children of their own because they die so early because of the mutation. So this means that a lot of the times the parents are both heterozygous and then they had that homozygous recessive child. So it's not, you don't see people with homozygous recessive that have kids a lot with these mutations that we're going to talk about. So what that means is you have two carriers. They both carry the recessive allele, but they're normal, and then they have a child that received a homozygous recessive that got both recessive alleles. And the child received the disease. But anyway, so you have autosomal recessive disorders. So like I said, a lot of the times they're homozygous recessive. Some of them are enzymatic disorders. So it might be like your metabolism not working right. So there's three main ways that you will see one of these genetic disorders. They're either going to be on an autosome, so an autosomal genetic disorder, a sex chromosome, so it's a genetic disorder affecting your sex chromosomes, or non-disjunction mutation, which is going to occur during when the chromosomes fail to separate in meiosis during anaphase 1. So that would be, non-disjunction would give you like a trisomy or a monosomy, like Down syndrome. So here you have some mutations. The two on the left are a hand that has, the one on the far left has an extra appendage, an extra finger, and then the one in the middle is going to have like a webbing, and then you have the one on the right, which is missing, it's a foot, and it's missing digits, missing toes. So sickle cell anemia is going to be one of the first autosomal genetic disorders that we talk about, because it's one of the more common ones, because people can survive with it into childbearing age and older. When I worked in the medical field, we had a lot of patients that would come in sickle cell crisis. Anyway, so this is autosomal and recessive. And so what happens is it has a mutated allele, and the hemoglobin in the person's blood is going to be shaped wrong. It's going to be shaped like a sickle, and I'll show you a picture in just a second. So it's caused by a recessive gene on chromosome 11, which is an autosome. So because the red blood cells are shaped into that sickle shape, the red blood cells cannot pass through all the little teeny tiny spaces in the blood vessels like they need to. And so that means that they die sooner. Those red blood cells die much sooner. So that causes you to be anemic and have low red blood cells. And they also get stuck and cause like little micro blood clots, and they block the flow of blood. So normal red blood cells last 3 to 4 months, and then they are replaced. They go through apoptosis, and then they are replaced by new ones. But sickle red blood cells only last 10 to 20 days before they die. So some things about sickle cell anemia. So first off, I told you I'd show you a picture. So if you look over here to the right, you have some normal red blood cells, and then you have the sickle shape. So you can see how these are not going to fit through the little teeny tiny spaces like they're supposed to. They're going to get stuck. So sickle cell anemia is common in the African American population. And you'll notice that certain genetic diseases are going to be common for certain genetic populations. So about 1 in every 12 African Americans are going to be heterozygous for sickle cell. In the heterozygous person, you might have symptoms, but usually you don't. If you're heterozygous for sickle cell, but of course that means you can have a child with it. So again, your red blood cells, they're not shaped right, so they'll block the blood vessels. This causes lots of different symptoms. It can cause organ damage. It causes lots of pain in like the hands and feet where your smallest blood vessels are. They are usually have a lot of trouble breathing because the blood cell, they don't have enough of the blood cells, and they can't move to your cells like they need, move through your blood to your cells like they need to. So they can't carry oxygen to your tissues, which again causes organ damage, but it's also going to make it feel like you can't breathe. They're very short of breath. One positive about sickle cell anemia is that you are usually immune to the disease malaria. So this disease, sickle cell anemia, because it is present in the African American population, they believe it, originated in Africa. And in Africa, one of the leading killers is malaria, and you get malaria from mosquito bites. So anyway, if you have sickle cell, or if you're a carrier for sickle cell, then that means that you are going to be immune to malaria. So that is the one positive there. Doesn't really help you if you live in the U.S. and we don't have malaria here. So here's just some symptoms that you might see. Fatigue is just being tired. They get very tired. They're breathless. They cannot catch their breath. They have pains all over. Then they might have swelling in their hands and feet because those blood vessels are going to be blocked. And then another thing they might have is jaundice, which is a yellowing of the eyes and skin, and that's caused by your liver not working right. Okay, so how I would do a Punnett square on this. So first off, it's autosomal, so I can use just normal letters. We chose to use S for sickle cell here. So again, be very careful because a big S looks like a little s. So we're going to cross someone who is a carrier, so big S, little s, with a man who is free of disease, so homozygous dominant, big S, big S. What is the chance of the couple having a child with sickle cell anemia? So a child with sickle cell is going to be little s, little s. So again, I'm going to make myself a key, big, 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 little, little, little. Okay, so this will be, they'll have the disease. Okay, this will be, they'll have a carrier if they're heterozygous, and then free of disease if they're homozygous dominant. Okay, so if I cross a homozygous dominant, someone's free of the disease, with a carrier, big S, little s, then this is what I will get. Okay, so I'll have two. These two will be normal. They'll be free of disease. And these two will be heterozygous carriers. Okay, the question asks, what are the chances of the couple having a child with the disease, which is little s, and that will be a 0 chance. Huntington's disease is the next genetic disease we're going to talk about. Huntington's disease is a little bit different than some of the other ones because it is a dominant genetic disease. We don't have very many dominant genetic diseases, but this one is autosomal and dominant. So again, these autosomal disorders are going to affect males and females equally. So, like I said before, a lot of these genetic conditions, you're not going to see people live past childbearing age because they're very horrible diseases. And sickle cell is one that, a lot of the times they will live older to have kids. Huntington's, they can also live, but they're going to definitely have a lower lifespan. So anyway, what happens with Huntington's disease is it's very gradual. You gradually lose your muscular control, and so that causes spasms. It causes mental illness, and eventually they die. So if you take a look, this is an MRI. This is what I used to do for a living, and you've got two brains here pictured, one on top of the other. Okay, so I'm going to draw a line here. Okay, so you have top brain, and then bottom brain. So this is two different people. Okay, so looking at these two brains, which one do you think is more normal looking? One of these is a normal brain, one is a brain with Huntington's. Okay, so hopefully you picked the bottom. The bottom is the normal brain. Let me tell you why. If you look at your variations of gray here, that is good. Okay, you have lots of color variations. Up here, all that black, all this black in the center is spinal fluid. Okay, CSF. That's not good because where all that spinal fluid is used to be brain tissue. You do have some fluid in your brain. Those are your ventricles, and they naturally hold fluid, and that acts as like a shock absorber. But you should not have that much fluid because what happens is the brain is slowly dying. Therefore, eventually they slowly die. All this really bright area is going to be non-functioning brain tissue. Okay, and example of that, this is what it would look like after a stroke. Okay, that after the brain tissue dies, like after a stroke. Okay, so all of that area is not going to work right. If you look down here, it's not bright white. Okay, so because this is a dominant disorder, my key is going to look a little bit different. Okay, so big H, little h, well, it's a dominant disorder, so if you have the dominant letter, you will have the disease. Okay, so these will have Huntington's. And so little h will be the only time when you're normal. Now, you might think, well, why do I have more people that don't have Huntington's? Well, because a lot of the times they die before they have kids. Now, with Huntington's, they might not, but they might. Anyway, so if you cross a heterozygous, so a big little, with someone who's normal, which is the only option for normal is little, and so I put those here and I cross them, then what are your chances of having an offspring with the disease? So with the disease can be big H or big H, little h. Okay, so these two will have the disease. And these two will not. They will be normal. So we have a 50% chance. Another really bad genetic disease is Tay-Sachs disease. So it is very rare. It's again autosomal and it's recessive. And it's so rare because these people do not survive to the age to reproduce. So the only way you get a child with Tay-Sachs disease is to have two parents that are carriers for the disease because it's recessive. And so with Tay-Sachs disease, the baby is born normal. You don't see any outward signs of any problems. And then eventually the baby begins to decline. And the baby declines because the baby cannot process. And so this fatty material builds up in their brain. So in the brain, basically normal brain tissue is replaced by this fat. So the child is normal at first, and then it's a gradual buildup, and at 6 months, around 6 months, they'll start having problems. They'll stop being able to swallow and feed, take their bottle or whatever. Then they become blind and deaf, and they have to have like a feeding tube, and eventually their muscles begin to just waste away, and eventually they become paralyzed. When they become paralyzed, then their muscles don't work. Their stomach can't work anymore. They stop breathing. So these babies usually die by the age of 4. So that's why they don't ever have kids because they die at such a young age. So it's a very awful on the child, of course, and on the family. Fortunately, it is very rare, but it does happen. I remember working in MRI and having to do an MRI on a baby that they were in the process of diagnosing, and the baby was about 6 months old, and the baby stopped being able to take the bottle like normal. And so because this is a genetic disease, as of now, there's no treatment and there's no cure for it. It's an autosomal, so it's found on chromosome 15, so it's really just a horrible thing. And so when we talk about genetic technology, this is where people begin to start looking into gene therapy, where they take out a diseased gene and they put in a normal gene. So let's say you as a parent have a child that has Tay-Sachs disease and your child dies. Well, if you want another a biological child, then you have, a risk of possibly having another child with the disease, this horrible genetic disease, and you wouldn't want to put the child through that. So the technology is there for gene therapy. They could take your sperm, take your egg, and they would only have to do it in one or the other, and they could take out the affected gene, that recessive gene, in one of them, because you'd have to get it from both parents. So they could take just the sperm or just the egg and take out that little H or that little T, and put the normal gene in, and then put the egg and sperm together in a petri dish, how they do with in vitro, and let it grow into an embryo, and then implant it into the woman, and then the woman, could have her pregnancy, and the baby would be normal. And so that's where all the talk about gene therapy comes in, is to cure some of these awful genetic diseases. Okay, so this is Tay-Sachs disease. It's just showing on chromosome number 15. It's where it would occur. Okay, cystic fibrosis is another one that you might have heard of. And cystic fibrosis is a common one also, and they do live till they're a little bit older as well. So this is autosomal and recessive. It's on chromosome 7, and that's an autosome. And it is recessive, so you'd have to get a affected allele from each parent. So what happens with cystic fibrosis is they produce this protein that we don't normally produce, and it makes you produce thicker and stickier mucus. So you have mucous membranes in many parts of your body. Pretty much your entire digestive tract is a mucous membrane. Your respiratory tract is going to be considered a mucous membrane. Urinary and reproductive tracts are going to all be considered mucous membranes. So, but what ends up happening with these people is that mucus usually causes them to have a lot of lung infections, and so they have other problems too, but usually they have a lot of lung infections, and they have these really nasty, hacky cough, and eventually they usually end up dying from a lung infection. They don't necessarily die from the cystic fibrosis, but because of the cystic fibrosis, they have frequent lung infections. And so a lot of the times they do die at a young age, usually in their 20s, mid-20s, maybe 30s. It just kind of depends on medical treatment and their lifestyle, because, you can treat lung infections to a point until you get to an infection that's maybe resistant, or maybe it's like a viral infection. But with medical advances, they are finding better treatments to treat lung infections. Some other problems that people with cystic fibrosis have is they have trouble digesting their food, because that extra thick, sticky mucus in their intestines doesn't allow them to absorb the nutrients in their food. So they don't have these digestive enzymes to help break down the food. Therefore, they cannot absorb the food. So they can eat and eat and eat and never absorb any of the calories. So a lot of the times they're going to be thin. One way they test for cystic fibrosis is by doing a salt test. So one weird thing is that they have salty tasting skin. Not sure who went around checking that, but they do a sweat test. So they are testing the saltiness of their sweat. So they'll have more salts than normal. And another thing is they're infertile because they have thicker, stickier mucus. The sperm cannot get to the egg. So again, this is a genetic disorder. There's no known cure. You would have to treat all the genes in all of those places that it affects the body. PKU is called phenylketonuria. This is another kind of more common genetic condition, and it's something that medical research has went a long ways on. In the United States, every infant is tested for this at birth. So anyway, this is an autosomal recessive disorder, and the baby or the person does not have a specific enzyme that converts the amino acid phenylalanine down. Okay, so all your amino acids have to be broken down into components to digest them. And this specific one, phenylalanine, cannot be broken down. And so what happens is, because it can't be broken down, it accumulates in the body, specifically into the central nervous system. And again, this is a very gradual thing, and it can cause mental retardation. I've actually had a student that had PKU at birth. And she had to take a special formula. This is why they test at birth. They test you for PKU, and if you have it, then you have to go on a special diet that does not have the amino acid phenylalanine. And this person, actually, she grew out of it. She eventually started producing the enzyme needed to break down phenylalanine. So again, we're very lucky to live where we live in a developed country with excellent medical care. The United States is known around the world for having some of the best medical care in the world. And so, like I said, every newborn is tested for PKU in our country. Very few other countries do this. But anyway, if PKU is detected, it's a simple blood test, simple little prick. And if the infant has it, they're put on a special diet that does not contain phenylalanine. They cannot, so you wouldn't be able to breastfeed. You'd have to go on formula. No meats because they do contain phenylalanine, because meat has a lot of protein in it. So anyway, supposedly the diet should be followed for life. Anyway, this is 1 in every 16,000 births. Okay, so that brings us to sex-linked genetic disorders. So the ones we've talked about so far are going to be autosomal disorders. So the rest of them we're talking about are going to be sex-linked or X-linked traits. So just to review, these are going to be traits that are found on your sex chromosomes. You only have one pair of sex chromosomes. If you're a female, that pair is an XX. If you're a male, that pair is an XY. So if you are someone who has a sex-linked genetic disorder, it's usually going to be found on the X. Okay, so because if you're a girl, you have two X's, and it's a recessive disease, then you would have to receive the disease on both of the X's. And girls can be carriers for these sex-linked recessive diseases. If you're a male, it's either on your X or it's not. You either have it or you don't. So the Y chromosome is said to be hemizygous because it is much different than the X. So the Y chromosome, when we looked at karyotypes before, you probably noticed that the Y chromosome is much smaller than the X chromosome, because usually the Y chromosome only carries mostly carries genetic information that makes males male. X chromosomes are going to carry other genetic information that's not gender specific, like some of these genetic disorders we're about to talk about. So again, it's called hemizygous because it's half the length, half, of the X chromosome, and that's because it contains a lot less genetic information. Okay, so again, we've already talked about this, but we'll talk about it again. Here it's written. So males only have one X. So they either have the disease or they don't. And so if they have the recessive allele, they either have it or they don't. A female can be a carrier. Okay, so if you're a carrier, you do not have the disease, but you could pass it to your children. The only way a female would get a recessive disease is if they get it from both parents. They get a recessive allele from both parents. So again, like I said, that Y is going to be pretty much just male-based traits, but the X is going to have a lot of different other traits. And we say that they almost exclusively show up in males because it's much easier for a male to inherit one of these traits. Males are always going to inherit their X from their mother. So if their father is colorblind, that doesn't usually mean that the male child will be colorblind. Now, there are some colorblind. There's multiple types of colorblindness. There are some that are linked to the Y chromosome, but most are linked to the X. So the first one we're going to talk about is one of the most popular one, is hemophilia. So hemophilia is considered the bleeder's disease. They're missing a factor in the blood that clots the blood. So it's also called the free bleeder's disease. So basically, if you get a cut, you don't stop bleeding. So here we have two different things. We have a pedigree, which we've already kind of looked at. And if you look at this pedigree, it is a sex-linked pedigree. Because remember, it's sex-linked if you have much more males with the disease. We only have one female with the disease out of 4 males. So I can clearly see that this disease is going to be sex-linked. Anyway, this is also showing a Punnett square of a sex-linked disease. Remember, with your sex-linked Punnett squares, you will always cross a XX, a girl, with a XY, a boy. Okay, and in this case, a plain X with nothing on it was unaffected. A X with a D on it was disease. So there's lots of ways that you could see these Punnett squares. But I want to point out something for you. You have to be very careful about the questions involving sex-linked traits, because if they ask you what % of offspring, then that's talking about all 4 offspring. Okay, so if I say what % of offspring have this disease, that would be out of all 4 offspring. So there would only be 1. Okay, this little boy here is the only one with the disease. Okay, but if I was to ask you what % of females have the disease, well, then I'm only looking at these 2. Okay, because the percentage of females does not count these boys. So the percentage of females, let's say the % of females that are carrier, well, that is 1 out of 2, so that will be 50% of females have the disease. Whereas if I said the % of offspring that are, 50% of females will be carriers. If I'm looking at the amount of offspring that are carriers, then that'll be 1 out of 4. Okay, because you're looking at all the offspring. If I'm looking at the number of females, that will be 1 out of 2. Okay, if I'm looking at males with the disease, that will be 1 out of 2, so 50%. So you have to be very careful with what the question is asking, especially on the sex-linked diseases. Okay, so this is just showing the inheritance of a sex-linked disease. So if you have a normal male and a carrier female, then all of the females are not going to have it because they would have to get an affected X from their dad. But 50% of females would be a carrier and 50% would be normal. And then the males, 50% would get an affected allele from mom and have the disease, and 50% would be normal. Okay, so example 1. Okay, so if you have carriers, then you know it's a recessive disease, and most of the time they are. So again, I'm going to start with a key. Okay, so I'm going to follow the format that we did here. So if it has the H on it, then that's hemophilia gene. Okay, so this will be a normal female. I'm just going to put F for female. This will be a carrier female. And again, only females are carriers. And then this will be a diseased female. And then male, there's only 2 options. Okay, it's either a normal male or a diseased hemophiliac male. Okay. Okay, so we're crossing a carrier female. It's very important to know which one's a carrier. Then it tells you the genotype. So my carrier female with, and I'm assuming cross with normal male because it didn't specify. So I bring my parents up here, bring them down and over. Okay, so here you have a normal female, and then you have a normal male, and then you have a carrier female because she has one normal X and one affected X, and then you have a hemophiliac diseased male. So I can ask a lot of different questions about that. So that's 4 different genotypes and 4 different phenotypes, which is what we just wrote out. Okay, so if I asked you what percent of offspring are carriers, then that would be 25%. If I asked you what percent of females were carriers, then that would be 50%, because you only have 2 females. So 1 out of the 2 females would be 50%. If I asked you what percent of males were hemophiliacs, that's 1 out of the 2 males, so that would be 50%. So you just have to be really careful with these, because you're like, yeah, I know how to do this, and you do the Punnett square, and then you don't pay attention to what the question is actually asking. So just be very careful with those percents. Another example, a female with the disease. So you cross it with a normal male because it didn't specify. And so you get 2 males. Both of these are going to be hemophiliac or diseased. And these would be carrier females, both of these. Again, I like to put a big H. I like to do it like big H, big H, big H, little h, little h, little h. But you can do it however you want, but just know you could see it either way. So anyway, looking at this one, you could have lots of questions here. What percent of offspring have the disease? Well, if you're looking at the percent of offspring, that would be 2 out of 4, so 50%. Okay, that would be these guys. So if you say, what percent of males have the disease? Well, 2 out of 2, both males have it. So that's 100% of the males have the disease. Looking here. If you said, what percent of females have the disease? Well, no females have it. So you just have to be careful of the question. Okay, so the other example of a sex-linked genetic disorder, again, is going to be on the sex chromosomes, is color blindness. Okay, so crossing a colorblind, actually this is a carrier female, a carrier female with a normal male. And so you would get a normal female, a carrier female, a normal male, and a colorblind, diseased male. Okay, so again, lots of different genotypes and phenotypes. These are the colorblind tests down here. So what you should be seeing, okay, you should be seeing a number 58, 18, the letter E, and the number 17. It's one of those weird 7s. Okay, so if you can't see those numbers, you might be colorblind. Okay, so then you have chromosomal mutations. So we've already touched on this before when we talked about non-disjunction mutation. So chromosomal mutations cause a change in the chromosome number and possibly the structure. And a lot of times this happens from non-disjunction. So this is when the chromosomes do not separate during meiosis. Usually in anaphase, that's when they should separate. And so what happens is you end up with, one cell with too many chromosomes and the other cell that doesn't have enough chromosome. And depending on which one of those gets fertilized, depends on what disease that the individual will have. So a monosomy is when you have one. Mono is one. Somy is chromosome. So you only have one of the chromosome. Remember, you're supposed to have a pair, so you should have two. And then a trisomy is when you have three instead of two. In animals, that's you. Monosomies are usually fatal if it occurs on the autosome. So most of the time, this would result in a miscarriage. But Turner syndrome is a monosomy involving the sex chromosomes, where you only inherit one X. Okay, so their genotype would be X0. Okay, so they all only got one X, so they would have 45 chromosomes, so only have one sex chromosome. A polyploidy is where you end up with more than two complete sets of chromosomes. So this is not something that is survivable in animals. So polyploidies do not happen in animals, but they do happen in plants. So this is how you get hybrid plants. And almost 50% of flowering plants and major crops involve some sort of hybridization. Changes in chromosomal structure. We've already talked about different mutagens that can cause that, like UV radiation, X radiation, gamma radiation, different chemicals, and even some viruses can cause chromosomes to break. Hopefully, COVID, the coronavirus, does not cause any chromosomes to break. So anyway, if the broken ends do not rejoin like they're supposed to, then this can cause a mutation. Okay, so some of the syndromes we're going to talk about. One of them is Klinefelter syndrome. Klinefelter syndrome, we've mentioned before. This is when they have the genotype of XXY. Okay, so XX would be female, XY would be male. The Y indicates a male. So basically they have XX, which would be for a female, but then they also have a Y, which would be for a male. So they kind of have like conflicting hormones, couldn't get the word out. So if you look down here, they have XX, and then that Y there also. Okay, so this would be Klinefelter's. The bottom, this would be a normal male, this would be a normal female, and this would be Turner syndrome. Okay, so anyway, with Klinefelter syndrome, they're usually taller than average, they have longer than average arms and legs, they're often sterile because they might have, like I said, conflicting hormones. Okay, so this will show some symptoms of Klinefelter syndrome. So again, the conflicting hormones. So they're considered male because of the Y, but they might have some female characteristics. For example, females have wide hips for childbearing and narrow shoulders. Males tend to have wide shoulders and a tall but narrow hips. So Turner syndrome. So again, Turner syndrome is only having one X sex chromosome, so they don't have that second X like they should. So they only have 45 chromosomes. That's what that says, is 45 instead of 46. So they do have female characteristics, but they are usually sterile, and their genitalia are going to be underdeveloped, because normally you would have two X's contributing the female type characteristics. A lot of the times they will have short webbed necks, wide chest, and a lot of the times they also have heart problems. But they usually do score above average on a IQ test, like a verbal IQ test. These individuals will usually have a normal lifespan. So the last one we're going to talk about is super male syndrome. So these are going to be sorry about Gemma in the background, XYY. So they are usually going to be fertile, which is unlike some of the other cases. They're usually going to be tall and they appear very normal on the outside. But one difference is that they are usually exceptionally aggressive. So you have a high number. They've done studies on people that are in state penitentiaries and mental institutions, and those that are incarcerated for very violent crimes. And they found a high number of those people are super males. So there's a genetic causation to their behavior, somewhat. Anyway, so a couple of other things. So about a quarter or 1/4 of all known pregnancies result in miscarriage. I talk about miscarriage because this is something that I experienced personally, and I feel like as a teacher I have a platform to explain to you guys, because it was not explained to me when I was young. I did not know how common miscarriages were until it happened to me. It's not something that people talk about. It's a very sad thing. It's a very awful thing to have to go through, but it is also a very normal thing. And most of the time there's nothing you can do about it. So miscarriage is also called a spontaneous abortion. Usually, when you have a miscarriage, it's because of some sort of chromosomal abnormality. They think more than half of the total known number of actual pregnancies result in a miscarriage. So 25 to 50% of pregnancies, they say, result in miscarriage. You might not, it might happen before you knew you were pregnant. And so, that would be a blessing, in my opinion, if you didn't know you were actually pregnant. Personally, I had miscarriages when I was further along, and we'd already seen the heartbeat. It's not very common after you see the heartbeat. We'd already seen the heartbeat with both of mine multiple times. So, like I said, this is just something that, scientifically it happens. And my husband and I, we were sent to see a geneticist because they are usually caused by chromosomal abnormalities. They ran karyotypes on us, and they checked our chromosomes, and fortunately our chromosomes were normal. And so a lot of the times they could have happened because of chromosomal abnormalities, but in my case they don't know for sure, but they think maybe the placenta was not developing, which would not be chromosomal. It will be more of a hormonal thing. And so I took a hormone with Gemma and with my son now, and they both, seem to be just fine. So anyway, that concludes the genetics unit. So hopefully you enjoyed this unit. Usually a lot of people enjoy it. You get a small glimpse into how you were formed, and how complicated we all are, because we have so many genes. So anyway, make sure you are very fluent with all the Punnett squares that we've learned, because you will see many Punnett squares on your test.